Hello, community, and welcome back to another Keeping It Real with Dr. Anita podcast. I am your host, Dr. Anita Polite Wilson, C-Suite Trusted Advisor, Elite Team Strategist, and Board Director, preparing organizations to better manage complexity, culture, and change. Today, on my Real Conversation from the C-Suite, I am so excited to have Mr. Todd Levinson and Mr. Andre Thomas, co-founders and hosts of the podcast, Healing Races. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you.
We're excited to be here.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's jump into it. Todd, you and I first met. Todd, how did we meet? Either somebody told you about me or somebody told me about you, but we had a conversation and hit it off like we've been knowing each other for years.
Yep.
Tell me, how did you and Andre come to establish the Healing Races podcast? Because based on what I saw on your website, this is not your regular kind of podcast.
No, it is not. Well, Andre and I were freshman roommates and close friends for almost 25 years. And in that time, never talked about race. Never used the word white, black, race, racial, nothing. And
well, I did, but behind his back.
Behind the scenes.
Okay, I was wondering. I'm like, you did that for 25 years. Come on. Okay, so I'm gonna put you on pause, Todd. What do you mean behind his back, Andre?
Well, because I mean, similar to maybe many Black people, you're this Black person and you have these white friends, and at times there could be just cultural differences. And this was the first time I ever lived with a white person. So, being freshmen in university, obviously the Black people got together and like, so what is your white roommate like? I'm like, girl, literally. So those words were used, he just didn't know about it.
Yeah.
All right. So now that we're spilling the tea, Todd, what do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, years later, I realized that was probably happening. But during the time, I was completely oblivious to it, which I think was part of the conversation that Andre and I had is, he asked me early on, what was it like growing up being white? And I, honestly told him I never thought about it. I never identified with the idea of being white. It's not that I didn't know that, race was an issue, that race was important to some people. It never crossed my mind much. And I think that was part of the genesis of the show, was really reflecting on the times that we were in and thinking about the fact we had never talked about it for 25 years and wondering, is this part of the problem or is this part of the solution? Right. Mm-hmm. And I wound up thinking it's a little bit of both, but I worried about the part of it that was the problem. And so that's when I approached Andre and asked him not just to have a conversation, but if he'd be willing to record it and make it public so that people could see what a conversation about race could look like from the beginning, between two people who were willing, because I have had many conversations with Andre, to ask the tough questions and have the hard conversations, but to do it in a way where we're getting to a better place. And so that's how it started.
I'm curious to know, Todd, where were you raised? And Andre, where were you raised? Because Todd, when you say I never really thought about being white, I think anybody who's not white thinks about that every day, just by the fact that we show up and you kind of get the side eye like, okay, what are you doing here? So where were you raised, Todd? Where were you raised, Andre?
Yeah, I was raised in greater West Los Angeles area. So Beverly Wood, Beverly Hills, West LA, were the areas that I was around during my childhood. And to be honest, you would think that so I grew up in a very Jewish community and around a lot of Jewish people for whom the identity of being Jewish was really important. Mm-hmm. And you'd think that maybe with the level of anti-Semitism around, that maybe I'd have some sort of sensitivity around thinking about one's identity racially, ethnically, religiously. But even with that religious identity being strong in my community, it's just not something that really crossed my mind a lot.
Mm-hmm. Interesting, because when I think about the Jewish community and the very little that I know of it, a client of mine, we were having a discussion one day, and she said, I straddle the fence between showing up as a white woman and showing up and divulging the fact that I'm a Jewish white woman. So when you talk about we'll get there. So when I talk about where you were raised in Beverly Hills, was there a whole lot of diversity in Beverly Hills when you were raised? And maybe that would play into the fact that you didn't think about being white because that was all that was around you.
No, there was not a lot of diversity. But in my world, there was a little bit of it. So there's a strong Persian community in Beverly Hills. I played in sports, and there was more diversity in sports. So it's not that I was never around diversity. My father was also a middle school teacher, and he worked in very diverse settings as well, and I got to have a little bit of engagement there. So not highly diverse by any means. It wasn't New York City, which is where I used to live as well, but it wasn't completely absent of diversity either.
Okay. All right, Andre, where are you raised and why are you shaking your head? What is going on?
Number one, I'm from Beyonce country.
Okay.
Number two, where even if you light skinned, you still black, so don't come around here tripping.
Right.
Number three, the New York City comment, because and maybe this is a great segue because I grew up in a large urban environment. Just for you all don't know, Houston is the third largest city in the United States. I looked it up recently because I'm in another large city. I'm like, which is which? And it really is the third largest city in the United States by population.
Okay.
And you had large communities of people that weren't always interacting, which is my perception of New York City and all the umpteen times that I've been there. I will concede I've never lived in a New York, whatever, but I do come from a large urban sprawling place. And when I don't mean a suburb of Beyonce country, I grew up in the center of Houston. Okay. And there was a strong identity of being black, of being African American. I remember growing up seeing Mickey Leland and all the political and philanthropic work that he was doing. And so there was Barbara Jordan is also another Texan. Yes, Barbara Jordan and her belief in the Constitution. So there was a definite ethos of pride in your race as manifest through the American dream. Mm-hmm. So the minute I walked into a room, I wasn't like, black everything, but there's a definite sense that you are African American. That is something to be proud of, and not only proud of it, demonstrably celebrated.
Mm-hmm. So when you all started living together, what was that like in terms of your own mini culture shock when you were starting to have conversations?
I'll take that one. Because this is the 1990s, because I'm now a man of a certain age who had a birthday. But I had been around many races because I went to a multiracial high school, but I was never one of few Black people. Even in the honors classes, I was one of many Black people. So I was, number one, taken aback how many Black people at the university were one of few. And that was a huge cultural clash with me because I'm like, wow. I had never heard that experience before. And then when it comes specifically to Todd and maybe other white people, it was the first time I had been in white homes socially. And I had a wonderful, wonderful Jewish teacher named Miss Goldsmith with whom I babysat her kids when I was in 11th grade. And absolutely wonderful children, an absolutely wonderful Spanish teacher and a wonderful human being. But it was the first time to ever have a day-to-dayness of white. I think a lot of Black people take whiteness, and white people in a per circumstance instance, but when you're sharing and cohabitating with someone, now I have a day-to-day routine with this man, and what does that mean? So for me, I had to lean in and feel open to the growth opportunity.
I love how you said my experience of day-to-day whiteness. That's an interesting way to put it. How did you feel about that, Todd?
About that comment or about being roommates? About
the comment and then being roommates. What was it like for you?
Did you
think about this experience of day-to-day Blackness the way
I did not think about it. Again, I did not think about that at all, and, it's interesting because it came out in our conversation during the podcast that, Andre became cognizant and conscious of ways of presenting in university that were, as he put it, rebuffed, right? That when he would naturally be his Andre self, he would get some kind of interpersonal blowback of some kind. But I knew none of that. First, I knew that he didn't know he was experiencing it, but I didn't even take it as such. For me, Andre was a developing friendship, just as I would have had in high school. And I shared with him that when I would, because in the day-to-dayness of being with Andre or with anybody, you often take on some of their mannerisms, personality, ways of speaking. And I would go back home and sometimes just out of my mouth would come phrases that I learned from Andre. And people would start smiling just as the way they do whenever they're around Andre, right?
I hadn't been corporified, Dr. Anita, yet. Now I'm corporified. So you wouldn't, for example, let's give her a concrete example, Todd. So we were talking about
he thinks he's all that in a bag of chips.
That was legitimately that was a phrase back in the 90s, right?
Yes, it was.
And Todd evidently went home and used said phrase. And they were like, what? And tell the story, Todd.
No, but they welcomed it. You see, the thing is that Andre, what I told Andre is he never got to see the 10, 20, 50 more white people in my network who either got to hear that phrase or if they did, would have welcomed him and enjoyed it and felt, an increasing, being drawn in, to want to talk to him, as many people are with Andre. But in his mind, he's getting blowback.
Because right? I'm at a PWI, right? I'm already from a city. I'm at a city from a city in the South that's urban, but also can be kind of country.
And for those in the community who don't know, PWI is predominantly white institution.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
And it was the first, and although I was a part of this wonderful organization called Inroads that kind of helped students transition into environments like that, and I had a corporate internship, I wasn't quite there yet because I'm thinking I'm around other students. I can behave the way I behaved in high school. That was a complete misconception. But for both Black and white students, I was like, oh, even the Black people, like, oh, you need to class it up. So I've since evolved.
This, though, if I might interject, this is why having conversation is so important, because whatever was going on in Andre's mind was I was oblivious to, and in fact, I was having, again, a different experience in taking up his mannerisms and seeing people's responses. And now it's 25 years later and we're having a conversation and he's telling me all these things that he was experiencing during that time. And because we never spoke about it, it was always behind the surface. And there's always, I'm sure, wonderings and self-consciousness and conscious of other people. When if you could just find a place to have a conversation about the way that race enters our interactions, personally, professionally, in the business workplace or wherever you might be meeting people, it can lead to a greater closeness because you get to know people better, but it also silences all the wonderings and self-consciousness that happens when you don't get to have that conversation.
Yeah. One of you had just mentioned the word transition, and automatically I got to thinking about some of the executive coaching that I do. And when I think about transitions, I think about the fact that as a professional, you've been very successful here. Your next step is here. Usually where professionals kind of derail or get hung up is the transition from here to here, right? It's the transition. You've already proven yourself here. It's a pretty good predictor of how successful you'll be here. But the transition is what gets us hung up. So I'd like to know, what was the transition between, okay, we are really good roommates, and hey, we've got a show. What was that catalytic conversation that said, we could do something with this and let's call it Healing Races?
So that happened. That was galvanized by the unfortunate death of George Floyd. And I've openly said I'm skeptical of white people just in general because of my environment, and even more so after having such a public death. Right, it was akin to a modern day lynching. And however, as many people, Todd had the idea that we had never had this conversation and then approached me about it. And I felt that it was important to at least answer questions or at least give a clarification to the degree that I am able in my particular Black experience. So, because I also self-identify as gay. And one of the promises that I made to myself when I came out of the closet decades ago was that if no matter what the question, and people had lots of questions about what it was like to be gay, I would always answer it. And I'm like, well, I can't make that promise in one area of my life and in not another area of my life. And so we, of course, if we're going to have such an in-depth conversation, because he and I are both garrulous, deep thinking, profound people, that's just where we're Pisces, and that's just where we live as a space. Then we need to share it with people, because you never know who can glean any insight. Now, kind of like the church I go to, take what you find is beneficial and leave the rest. And that's really the spirit in which I entered the conversation. I never expected to be radically transformed or to radically transform others, including Todd. But I did feel if people were open to any sort of clarification regarding African-American thinking, and I say that because even though I've traveled wide and far, I've predominantly lived in this country, then I would be willing to contribute to the conversation on that clarification.
Thank you. And Todd, what was your take on the transition from roommates to this very introspective and insightful podcast that you all have called Healing Races? And where did the name come from?
Yeah. A couple of things around that. I think there was a transition in openness through having conversation, right? And Andre and I, in reflecting on our first set of conversations, discussed this, where, all the skeptics, all the wondering inside his mind that we talked about in the college context was definitely there, and you could see an increasing openness, to sharing more and more and being more and more.
It's a demystification process.
Yeah. And he had there was a really revealing moment when Andre told me about how his family said, "Why are you telling Todd all these things?" And he said, because he has a genuine interest and curiosity and respect that he brings to the conversation. And I think that had to be earned through the conversation when he started to realize that I was really listening. And I don't know what the moment was for him in particular, if it was a set of moments, but
no, I can tell you, to quote Brene Brown, people have to earn the right to know your story. You don't just go around because you want people to be respectful of your story. So the transition was when and it was not one particular moment, but when I felt you're coming with a sense of respect for what my story is, that's when I opened up.
And just, I don't know, gaining insight. I feel like, there were a couple moments when he was like, yes, that's exactly how I feel. And I knew, and I could see him change after that, because it's like I could finally read between the lines and hear the story. And I would always pair it back to him. Do I understand what you're saying? So I'll give you an example of when that happened. We talked about reparations. And I'm someone who generally is open to the idea, because for me, there's a sense of, maybe it's my Jewish background and all the things that have happened to Jews. I don't know what it is, but there's just a basic sense of fairness in me that when someone's wronged, you make it right. And I don't know what the path to that is. I don't know what it looks like, but the fact of going that direction seems right. And I brought up the topic, and Andre had an interesting point of view on it, where he said, yes, he believes in some idea of reparations, but not cash payments, investment. And the basic crux of it was that he wants to know that Black Americans are valued in this country. And just giving some money, yes, there's a sense of repair there, but not necessarily. It could be, well, now let's be done with it. Not a sense of investment in where you value and care about someone. And that was profound for me to understand. But there was a moment of me realizing that was the underlying motivation, and saying that back to him in my own words, and I could see a change in him, because he knew I was listening and really trying to understand where he was coming from. So I feel like it was moments like that over time, increasingly opened the space for more dialogue. And I can share more moments like that, should it be relevant.
We will definitely get into more moments like that in our upcoming conversations. Community, I want you to take note of the fact that Todd said when Andre felt listened to and understood, that's when things started blossoming. And that is One of the 7 habits of highly effective people: seek first to understand, then to be understood. And we're going to get into that when we come back in our next conversation, our next real conversation from the C-suite with Mr. Todd Levinson and Andre Thomas. In the meantime, if this conversation, and I'm sure it did, we started off with a bang. If this conversation helped you to reframe hot topic conversations from difficult to different, please share it with your network. Repost with your own comments, because our community is a learning community. I want to know what you have to say. And then, as you know, I'm always going to ask you to stay in the flow with me. Follow, like, and overshare this conversation or any other of my podcasts to help you reframe hot topic conversations from difficult to different. Until next time, this is Dr. Anita reminding you to stay blessed and keep it real.